Thank you for tuning in to the Pink Monorail podcast. My name is Noah. I'm not the regular host. That would be Shelley and Alice. I'm doing a special report for them on Disney in China. Today, we pick up on how the company turned around the underperforming Hong Kong Disneyland park. The Disney company had spent $465 million to expand the Hong Kong Disneyland resort and try to stem annual losses. It was not Hong Kong Disneyland that set the precedence for underperforming parks. The Disneyland resort added a second gate on February 8, 2001. Disney California Adventure, DCA, was considered a dismal experience from the get-go. First-time visitors and season pass holders commented on how little it resembled a traditional theme park and how much of the Disney magic was absent from the experience. The park was supposed to be an amalgamation of the California experience, offering the sights and sounds of beaches, boardwalk, Hollywood, Bay Area, and national parks in one centralized location. The theming was loose and disjointed. Many visitors were sad that the mascot characters were absent from the park. The rides were not attractions at all and were literally off the shelf. They could be found at any other amusement park and even state fairs. Early visitors to the park tried a few rides and quickly found themselves headed across the plaza for Disneyland. The Seoul Dark Ride, the Superstar Limo, was a prime example of the cheapest attraction that Imagineering could come up with. It was saturated with what people call minimatronics. Flat, painted backdrops replaced the lush three-dimensional scenery that made Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion so memorable. Cheesy dialogue and pandering to celebrity culture quickly dated the attraction. It and the park collectively lacked the timeless appeal of Disneyland. Moreover, it did not seem well suited for young visitors. Walt Disney had wanted to build a park that was a refuge for families from the amusement parks and carnivals of his era. DCA seemed to embrace all the things that Disneyland was not, and audiences were not happy about it. To put it into perspective, how well known the problems with the park were, the cartoon The Simpsons, they called it out twice in their series. In The Great Louse Detective, the family visited Springfield Penitentiary. Marge Simpson said she didn't think prison was a great place to bring her children, to which her daughter Lisa replied, "It still beats Disney's California Adventure," and the rest of the family agreed. Then in the episode, My Mother the Carjacker, Homer Simpson tried to hide his fugitive mother, someplace where there's nobody for miles. Disney's California Adventure, the voice of public opinion, had spoken. Promotions and park hopper passes did little to improve the gate or stem the losses that DCA was incurring on the parent company. When CEO Michael Eisner stepped down in 2005, the new management had to undo years of neglect and budget cuts to the theme parks and creative capacity of the company. The new CEO, Robert Bob Iger, started by naming Pixar Chief Creative Officer John Lasseter as the principal creative advisor for Imagineering. Lasseter would be responsible for helping sort out the mistakes made in DCA, as well as find ways to incorporate Pixar properties into the Disney parks. Lasseter was a former Disneyland park employee and was intimately aware of how special the park was to visitors and what made it special. He was not the only person within the company that had this unique insight. The Imagineers got together with management and created a plan to remake DCA. There was a stronger focus on creating themes for each area of the park and beginning to incorporate more Disney characters into the fold as well. They took out several off-the-shelf rides and created original attractions instead. The boardwalk and carnival atmosphere were softened with a Toy Story theme. The company created a plan of action and little by little closed down and rebuilt entire portions of the park without completely shutting down the day-to-day operations. Disney California Adventure expanded by almost a third with a new Cars Land. The Orange County Register made a map with all of the changes that DCA underwent in 10 years. The park was rededicated in 2012 by Iger. The end result was a park that amazed seasoned visitors and won over jaded fans. In 2012, it earned 3 awards from the Themed Entertainment Association. Cars Land received the award for New Theme Park Land. Radiator Springs Racers was honored in the attraction category, and Carthay Circle Restaurant and Lounge received an award for Theme Park Restaurant. In addition, Disney's Hawaiian resort, Aulani, received the award for Themed Hotel Resort in 2012. The changes in the park swelled attendance and changed the popular opinion of DCA. All of the fixes applied to DCA did not come cheap. The budget assigned for the project was set at about $1 billion. Some Disney insiders mentioned that the final cost to the park was much higher, closer to $1.8 billion. Yet, all of the Disney executives and Imagineers came to a consensus. They were willing to spend the money to create a park that could withstand the test of time. They were willing to create a park that was more in tune with the vision of Walt himself. It told a story. It had many original ideas and attractions that could not be experienced in any other park. It would not have to be redone again because every area of the park was much stronger individually and collectively. If something turned out to be problematic down the road, there was still room to change an individual area of the park without creating a major logistical problem. As long as there was imagination, then the park would never be complete. This work ethic would be applied to every park and not solely to Disneyland. Iger and his senior team had their work cut out for them overseas as well. Hong Kong Disneyland debuted just as Eisner had left the company. The same strategy, tight budgets, cut corners, and recycled attractions that had affected the gate for DCA were costing Disney hundreds of millions of dollars overseas every year. It would not cost as much to expand Hong Kong Disneyland as it had to repair DCA. The majority of the park was well done, and it was a variation on the classic Magic Kingdom. Moreover, by building the expansion during a recession, the company was able to save money on material and labor that would have been sold to them at a premium otherwise. The previous episode on our journey through China mentioned that the first expansion, Toy Story Land, was the first stage in rebuilding Hong Kong Disneyland. It used rides, technology, and a layout that had been incorporated into Disneyland Paris a year earlier, so the turnaround time was relatively short. The time and energy saved creating that land helped buy the Imagineers time to design and develop completely new lands and attractions for their Chinese customers. Hong Kong Disneyland had turned the corner in 2011 with the opening of Toy Story Land. The new land helped slow the tremendous losses that the park had been experiencing previously. A year later, the park opened Grizzly Gulch, formerly known as Grizzly Trail. Joe Lanzicero, the senior vice president of Walt Disney Imagineering Creative, helped plan and design the largest new land for Hong Kong. It had been in the works since 2007, when negotiations for an expansion began. Lanzicero started with the company as an animator 30 years ago before becoming an Imagineer. He worked on Imagineering projects for the company for over 22 years and worked his way up to the executive status. He learned that one of the secrets to Disney's success was in serving the story. Every area of the park, whether it was a cart, a restaurant, a train depot, or e-ticket attraction, had to serve a story. It had to reinforce a theme and be consistent. He learned as much from his mistakes as he had from his successes. When he gave public presentations, he reminded artists that failure was an important learning tool. Hong Kong Disneyland got off to a rough start because the company had played it safe. Too safe. The park lacked originality, and worse, was smaller than any other park they had built. The Disney company had made mistakes, and it was up to them to correct things. After all, their partner, the Hong Kong government, had no experience running a theme park. The expansion was a start, but each land had to be unique and give visitors something that they would remember and a reason to return. Toy Story Land scaled up classic toys from Hasbro and the Pixar films and made visitors see the world from a new perspective. Grizzly Gulch was themed as uniquely. It opened July 14th, 2012, and was set in the American West during the Gold Rush. It could be considered the equivalent of Frontierland for the park. The Wild West had been romanticized in the US. However, it was even more exotic and alluring to people in foreign countries. Cowboys, Native Americans, train robbers, saloon brawls, and shootouts were awe-inspiring on film. Being able to walk through a Western town with all the sights and sounds of the classic West was a treat for Chinese visitors. Disney had even incorporated its trademark Smell-It-Sir technology to pipe in the scent of freshly cut timber and other aromas into the land. The amount of details and tangible structures for visitors to explore could not be understated. These were far from the flat two-dimensional models that had made Superstar Limo and DCA a forgettable attraction. People were not looking at a painting of the Old West, they were actually walking through it. The new expansion had a unique story. It was a snapshot in history of the luckiest day, of the luckiest month, of the luckiest year. Chinese numerologists believed that 8 was a lucky number associated with wealth, so all the details in the land reinforced that idea. It may sound curious, but the culture does have many examples of adhering to those traditions. Forget about the number 13. The number 4 was considered unlucky. It was the number of death in many Asian countries. As such, most hotels and buildings do not have a 4th floor. Getting a license plate in China with 8 or 88 was the luck of a lottery system draw or on public bids. Those license plates could go for thousands of dollars. The Chinese would be very fortunate to have Grizzly Gulch. The year was August 8th, 1888. A gigantic gold nugget had just been pulled from the 88-foot-tall Big Grizzly Mountain, and prosperity was abundant. But something was also odd about the land. It seemed that the grizzly bears living near the mountain had not left when the town sprang up. There were bite and claw marks all over the signs, benches, and details inside and outside the western buildings. Riders on the Big Grizzly Mountain minecarts learned that the bears had scared off the miners and had inadvertently turned the operation into an e-ticket coaster. The runaway mine coaster was nothing like the classic Big Thunder Mountain, but it did pay tribute to that and the earlier mine train through Nature's Wonderland at Disneyland. Grizzly Gulch was also the home to Geyser Gulch, a place where springs and fountains prompted guests to splash each other and cool off on hot summer days. Grizzly Gulch was designed with multiple photo opportunities in mind. The Chinese in the South were a counting culture and took notice of all the new things they could experience for their money. Disney had considered making one giant land during the expansion, but decided that visitors would appreciate 3 lands more, each with unique attractions, shows, restaurants, shops, and photo opportunities. They were right. The third expansion, Mystic Point, opened May 17, 2013. Lanzicero and his fellow Imagineer, Mark Shermer, came up with a new land that had never existed in any other Disney park and was ripe with new ideas and technology. 2 unique areas for photo opportunities and a stage show had appeared in Mystic Point. The first was the Garden of Wonders. Relics from lost civilizations adorned the courtyard. If visitors looked at them from the correct angle, then the freestanding statues would merge and create a single object. The techniques to create optical illusions had been worked out in Tokyo Disneyland during seasonal events. The second area, the Mystic Point Freight Depot, made use of the space in front of the Disneyland Railroad. It had large cultural artifacts arranged for more photo opportunities. It also featured a platform for a small stage show to be performed featuring characters from around the world. Mystic Point was settled in 1908 by Lord Henry Mystic. Like Grizzly Gulch, this area of the park also had a specific era in mind. In this case, it was the era of exploration. Turn-of-the-century adventure had also been romanticized in the West. Lord Mystic traveled the globe, collecting artifacts and preserving them in his estate. Some of his collection was on display at the Garden of Wonders, while his most recent items had just been unloaded at the Mystic Point Freight Depot, where his nephew was in charge of cataloging them. His house, the Mystic Manor, would be the setting for a dark ride in the tradition of Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion. We're going to look at this illustrious palace of magic and mischief. When Lord Henry Mystic arrived in a certain jungle, he fell in love with it and decided to build his estate there. His mansion, a multi-story Victorian house, included architectural influences from all of the places in the globe he had visited. Mystic Manor stood majestically above Mystic Point and invited visitors to explore the collection of Lord Mystic. This was the backstory that Imagineers Jolan Cicero and Mark Shermer had developed for the attraction. Every detail found within Mystic Point supported this story. What the Imagineers wanted to do was give Hong Kong a classic dark ride that could be held to the same standards of Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion. A variation of the Haunted Mansion could be found in every park, after all. Each version of the Haunted Mansion fit within the theme for each land. The original attraction was set in Orleans Square in Disneyland. It was stylized after the enormous plantation houses in the South. In Walt Disney World, it was located in Liberty Square and was modeled after a Gothic Revival architecture. Tokyo Disneyland received a copy of the Walt Disney World Haunted Mansion, but this time they placed it in Fantasyland. The Imagineers that worked on the original attraction with Walt Disney could not decide how scary, macabre, or whimsical the attraction should be, and thus the ride had multiple aspects intertwined. For Disneyland Paris, the building was supposed to be set within Thunder Mesa, the frontierland of Paris. The southern-style building would not have worked in the Old West, so the ride and theming were changed drastically. Elements from the cancelled Western River expedition meant for Walt Disney World were incorporated with technology and gags from the Haunted Mansion and a new Western-inspired Victorian mansion. The new version of the Haunted Mansion was more macabre and much darker than the original attraction. The changes to the ride were done to help the attraction tell a story that unified Thunder Mesa, Big Thunder Mountain, and the newly named Phantom Manor. The changes were also made to appeal to European taste. The French were fond of theatrics and strong romantic themes. Walt Disney did not want the Haunted Mansion to look unkempt or dilapidated, like a typical haunted house in the US was supposed to. This would not work in his pristine new park. In other parks, the property around the mansion was well kept as a matter of tradition. Thunder Mesa in Paris had a much darker theme, and as such, the Imagineers broke from tradition and created a landmark that looked like it was in need of maintenance. Dead landscaping, cobwebs, peeling paint, and a boot hill cemetery helped frame the property. The French incorporated the catacombs under the streets of Paris, where some 6 million bodies were buried, into the Paris Musée, or public museum network. As a culture, they romanticized the macabre in their stage plays. The Phantom of the Opera was set in Paris, after all. Many of these uniquely French ideas returned within the Phantom Manor. This obsession with death and the undead would not have gone over well in China. The Chinese had a culture that was built on devotion to their ancestors. They prayed for them and honored the dead throughout the year. Superstition warned that ghosts or restless spirits could undo dynasties. The horrors that upset spirits could inflict on the living was tangible. The idea of having a dark ride go through a cemetery and have ghosts dancing and singing about was much too macabre for the Chinese. With that said, they still enjoyed a good scare. The Disney parks had begun growing their seasonal festivities the world over. No other holiday seemed to be gaining as much momentum as Halloween. Asian countries honored their dead, and they had definite superstitions regarding ghouls and ghosts, but monsters, vampires, werewolves, and even zombies were somehow fantastic enough as to not offend their customs. There were broad differences between the Asian parks and how they celebrated Halloween. Tokyo Disneyland had an event that was very much in tune with their USA counterparts. In the US, Mickey's Not So Scary Halloween Party was a family-friendly event that took place from the end of September through October. A comparable celebration called Disney's Halloween took place in Tokyo Disneyland, a variation in Tokyo Disney Sea. Disney's Haunted Halloween in Hong Kong was completely different. It was much darker, much scarier, and far more macabre than any other park. The ghouls from Phantom Manor would have fit right into the areas of the park that were transformed during the month of October. Mazes were set up in Main Street, themed the Main Street Haunted Hotel, and at Adventureland near the Jungle Cruise. The Demon Jungle let those that had died in the jungle come back for revenge on the living. These types of mazes had been wildly successful at Universal Studios' Halloween Horror Nights and of course at Knott's Berry Farm in October. The Scary Farm was the grandfather of theme park Halloween celebrations. The month of October could get the Knott's Ledger in the black. While the entirety of Hong Kong Disneyland was not too dark for families during the season, the mazes themselves did appeal to older teens and young couples. The thing that attendees would notice, however, were the lack of ghosts in Hong Kong. The majority of character costumes were based around traditional monsters. Lanzicero and Schirmer learned what was culturally acceptable for families and designed a ride around magic rather than the dearly departed. Magic could bring inanimate objects to life. It could be whimsical, mischievous, and most important for the Imagineers, they could control the magic. They had to figure out how to tell a story in the land, in the queue and on the ride of Mystic Manor itself. Visitors learned that Lord Mystic owned the land around his colorful house and it was covered in wondrous artifacts. Inside Mystic Manor was no different. Antiquities from all over the world decorated the shelves and cabinets of its foyer. The paintings on the walls also told a story about Lord Mystic and his traveling companion, a monkey he named Albert. Lord Mystic had saved the monkey from a gigantic spider, and the two had become inseparable. Most recently, Mystic had gained the possession of a Balinese music box, which could allegedly bring objects to life. Albert was obsessed with the box and tempted fate by opening it and letting loose all of the magic within. Disney contacted Danny Elfman, the award-winning composer of A Nightmare Before Christmas and many other Tim Burton features, to write the music for this attraction. The Imagineers helped introduce a new ride system into Mystic Manor as well. Instead of the clamshell-shaped doom buggies from the Haunted Mansion, which pointed audiences at specific scenes, the new Mystic Magneto-electric carriage allowed visitors to look around at the scenes in each room of the house. The carriages were able to guide visitors through the rooms and even ride sideways or turn 360 degrees to give riders a unique perspective each time they rode the attraction. The end result was nothing short of awe-inspiring. The Imagineers had created an amazing dark ride that could hold up to the standards set by the best within the company. It had similar pacing and storytelling elements to the Haunted Mansion, but with none of the gruesome details. Instead, Albert got caught up in the magic that he had unleashed. At first it seemed benign, bringing musical instruments to life and turning paintings into moving scenery. But as that magic traveled through the manor, it became more and more dangerous to the little monkey, especially once it reached the armory. The final room featured an icon from Chinese literature brought to life, a statue of Sun Wukong, the legendary Monkey King from the story of Journey to the West, started moving and began whipping the magic into a hurricane. Poor Albert finally managed to close the lid on the music box and seal away the magic before Lord Mystic could find out. The final room in the attraction meant a great deal to the Chinese visitors. The Monkey King was a direct connection to the spiritual beliefs of the nation as well as to its cultural heritage. The story of the Monkey King, a once prideful and arrogant magical monkey who was chastised by Buddha. He had to redeem himself by escorting a Buddhist monk on his travels. This story had been adapted to manhwa, which are comic books, animation, and of course the Chinese opera. The story was well known the world over. The acrobatic character of Sun Wukong had dazzled audiences for centuries. He was one of the few internationally recognized figures that was distinctly Chinese. Having Disney come into China and bring the character to life filled domestic visitors with pride. There was a reason that the Imagineers chose a monkey to begin the action with. The curiosity of Albert, his inability to heed his master's warnings, and the chaos he unleashed paralleled the early life of Wukong. The character actually transformed from the beginning of the ride to the end. Albert had been tossed around by the four elements, snapped at by a giant carnivorous plant, and chopped by animated suits of armor. In the end, Albert found his courage and managed to close the music box just before it could destroy the manor. The animatronic monkey started with a clean costume, but by the end his fur was singed and his wardrobe shredded. Albert became a heroic character that still retained just a little bit of that sense of mischief. After all, visitors would expect him to trigger the magic box each time they visited the park. With the expansion in Hong Kong, the visitors from China felt like they were finally getting their money's worth out of Disneyland. Moreover, they had a character, an attraction that was unique to their park and reflected an important bit of their culture. The creation of Albert and the inspiration behind Mystic Manor actually went back before ground had even been broken on the resort. There had been many successful parks outside of the original Disneyland. These parks gave audiences the attractions they wanted yet never expected. The Disney Imagineers had actually learned how to adapt attractions for the Asian market well before Mystic Point was conceived. At Disney's Hollywood Studios in Florida, the Imagineers had developed an attraction called the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror. It was an elevator drop ride inspired by the classic television show. When a second park was being added to Tokyo, known as Tokyo Disney Sea, they needed new attractions. The Tower of Terror was a fantastic ride. However, the Japanese had no point of reference for the television series. The story behind the ride had to be redone and presented to audiences through the theming, architecture, and queue of the ride. The Hollywood Hotel was the home of the original attraction. A freak lightning strike had hit the side of the hotel and made it disappear. Officially, part of the hotel had burned down and collapsed. However, there was no wreckage and no survivors were ever found. The Disney Imagineers did a great job of creating a tower that looked like part of it had been blown away. Those that rode the service elevator reported that they could still see the previous occupants that disappeared more than a half century prior, calling to them. It appeared as half the hotel would be trapped for eternity in the Twilight Zone. It was a great story. When the familiar guitar twang of the Twilight Zone theme played during the pre-show, it was enough to raise goosebumps on most visitors. The Japanese were not familiar with the show at all. They had no idea who the host Rod Serling was or how he wrote and directed most of the episodes. The Imagineers came up with an entirely new backstory for the attraction, one which had a more timeless feel. In the revised version, an explorer named Harrison Hightower built a hotel to host his treasures that he had accumulated on his many expeditions. Harrison was a member of the Society of Explorers and Adventurers. It was an organization that predated, canonically, the Adventurers Club from Walt Disney World. Harrison Hightower was a very arrogant man, stealing artifacts for his own selfish reasons rather than gathering them with the approval of local tribes and governments. One of his acquisitions, an idol named Shiriki Utundu, had been worshipped as a god to a small African tribe. They were furious of this theft of this idol and warned him of dire consequences that it would bring to him unless he returned it. Hightower laughed at this superstitious notion. He could be seen carrying around his find in the lobby of his hotel. Before he departed for his penthouse suite, he made the mistake of mocking the idol and putting a cigar out on its head. This enraged Shiriki Utundu. When Hightower rode the elevator, a bolt of green lightning struck it and brought it crashing down. His hat was recovered, but a body was never found. The hotel was restored, and the new owners wanted the visitors to enjoy the collection of Mr. Hightower and disregard any myth surrounding the idol. Imagineering managed to create a new story for the ride that was as richly themed as the original Hollywood Hotel. They connected the popular Adventurers Club to Tokyo and showed that members of the society were indeed world travelers. Many of the members were modeled after Imagineers. Hightower was based on Joe Rohde. He had conceived the Adventures Club and was the senior designer on Disney's Animal Kingdom. He did not mind playing a villain for the sake of a good story. Another notable member was Lord Henry Mystic, the founder of Mystic Point in Hong Kong. The parks in the USA and Asia were now interconnected with a rich theme and history. The two characters of Hightower and Mystic could be seen as opposites, yet both also reflected the attitude of late 19th century explorers. While one gathered antiquities and artifacts with the purpose of preserving and sharing them in museums, the other did the same, but out of a sense of personal entitlement. Albert the monkey was a friendly character that accompanied Mystic on his travels. An act of compassion had saved him from certain death. As such, Albert was a very loving and loyal to Mystic. By contrast, Hightower carried around the stolen idol like a trophy, showing it off to the elite and powerful, and mocking its cultural significance. There was no reason why Shiriki Utundu should have been kind to Hightower. Both rides had opposite themes as well. Hightower Hotel was designed to scare visitors, whereas Mystic Manor was designed to fill them with wonder. The Adventurers Club was closed down in 2009. Many of the artifacts from the club were transported to Hong Kong to be put on display as part of Mystic Manor. Joe Rohde gave Pink Monorail founder Shelley a hint as to how he decorated the club all those years ago. All of the objects at eye level were authentic pieces gathered from around the world. Visitors could study them as closely as they wanted and verify their authenticity. The items set lower and higher were replicas, so that they would not go well over budget. Some of the objects turned up as set dressing in various shops in Florida, and at the Trader Sam's Enchanted Tiki Bar in Disneyland and Trader Sam's Grotto in Walt Disney World. Longtime visitors to the club would be glad to learn that the Imagineers were able to preserve the majority of the items and keep them tied canonically together through the various parks. Albert could be considered the first new mascot designed exclusively for the Chinese theme park. He could act as a sort of cultural ambassador between all of the parks, in fact. The monkey has such a warm personality that he could interact with Mickey Mouse and his friends and help build bridges of cultural understanding and relevance. This was something that was critically important in all of the parks. The Disney mascots had to become not only familiar to audiences, but they had to be embraced by them. When Mickey and Minnie first entered Japan, they were very much seen as US cultural ambassadors. Mickey and Minnie wore their traditional costumes, red trunks for Mickey and a polka dot dress for Minnie. They remained in their traditional costumes in the early days of the park. Eventually, the Imagineers picked up on cultural cues, events, and traditions of Japan and began to dress up the mascot characters accordingly. Every detail that went into the character costumes was done with careful planning. After all, a misstep was the difference between being patronizing to a culture and celebrating it. Mickey and Minnie would eventually appear in authentic Japanese kimono robes and lead holiday festivals in accurate costumes. The Japanese loved it. If Disney wanted to be successful in China, it had to apply the same intense level of planning. There were broad differences between the regions in China, and Disney wanted to make sure that they were able to repeat their success in Hong Kong. The colors of the costumes, the patterns, and fabrics were very traditional. The appearances of each character were not the only things that Imagineers planned out. The way the cast members performed had to be culturally appropriate as well. How they greeted guests, how they made gestures, stood, and walked all had to be considered. A slight nod or bow was much more polite and inviting to a customer in Asia, just as a wave and a hug would have been expected in the USA. The Oriental Land Company, the owners of the Tokyo parks, wanted to go a step further and create a character that was distinctly Japanese but would fit right into the Disney family. Tokyo Disney Sea had introduced a mascot that served a similar purpose to Albert but many years earlier. Duffy was a teddy bear created by Minnie Mouse so that Mickey would not get lonely on his travels. The bear gained a personality all his own and became a popular fixture at the park. He was even given a girlfriend a few years later named Shelley May. Currently, Duffy can be seen in every park around the world. He had been given roles as a leader of the floats and seasonal parades. His outfits represented every area of the world he had visited, along with Mickey. These limited edition garments, worn by the bear, became desired by collectors. Albert may not be the right character for an international wardrobe makeover. However, a few variations of his jacket and hat could continue to be nods to classic Chinese fashion and help drive brand identity for the company overseas. It was brand awareness and a shifting consumer culture that brought Disney to China in the first place. The Chinese economy was beginning to build tremendous momentum in the 80s when Michael Eisner was in his early days with the company. By the time he handed control over to Bob Iger circa 2005, China was beginning to dictate global trends. The Chinese consumers were unique to those from other nations. Their taste, their buying patterns and expectations were much different than those in other Asian countries. Disney had to figure out how to best tap into that market. What better way than by giving the nation their own theme park? Over the past few years, there had been reports that the unparalleled growth in China's gross domestic output had been inflated. As stated earlier in the series, the Chinese government had created 5-year plans to improve the infrastructure, standard of living, and economy for all of their citizens. Part of these plans involved large land development deals that poured billions into the construction sector, making many rich in the process. Forests were cleared. Residents that had lived in the same area for countless generations were dispossessed, and buildings, schools, and hospitals sprang up overnight, all in the name of progress. These bold changes helped an economy move away from manual labor towards intelligence-based jobs. It raised the standard of living for many and helped strengthen the middle class. However, there would be a price to pay for such rapid growth. There would be stretches of office and residential buildings created in the construction gold rush, but sadly, they remained empty for years. These ghost cities demonstrated that China was ready for growth, whether the nation needed it or not. The environmental issues that China faced would now have to become a part of their long-term planning. That was, of course, if the government could acknowledge environmental challenges to begin with. Perhaps it was a strong sense of guanxi, the trusted relationship that was the backbone of the Chinese business structure, that kept the government contractors from raising their concerns. It was hard to ignore the ghost towns and the construction bubble that China seemed to be inflating. Why would Disney do business in an economy that seemed on the verge of a major recession? Moreover, why did they choose Hong Kong and then Shanghai in which to build multi-billion-dollar parks? There was a method to the Disney plan. First and foremost, they had to get established in the booming economy. Universal and several other theme park developers also had plans to expand overseas since the 80s. When Michael Eisner signed a deal with the Hong Kong government, he had committed the company to a long-term partnership with the nation. There was no way that Disney was going to let its shareholders down. The company was focused on the expanding middle class. Within 2 generations, they had grown into a strong consumer-oriented base. They began emulating and then surpassing the consumer trends from the West. For example, where beef was once a luxury food and would seldom be had for a meal, the average middle-class family in China was now consuming twice as much beef as their US counterparts. Also on the rise was conspicuous consumption. The sale of luxury items had exploded in the new millennium. Chinese consumerism was on the rise, especially among government employees and officials. The nation was becoming very brand conscious. Shoppers began demanding the most exclusive fashion labels. The country was once mocked by the Western world for counterfeiting goods and producing second-rate knockoffs of electronics and clothing. The new consumer base wanted nothing but the genuine article. This explosion in demand meant that many unscrupulous people would set up knockoff stores, including fake Apple stores and fake Nike stores that fooled many customers and raised the ire of the Chinese government. English was the en vogue language. Chinese labels did not appear as trendy to buyers. even if they could not read English. Many boutiques opened up with nonsensical phrases all throughout Asia. Brand awareness was steadily growing. Savvy shoppers knew what they were looking for and began tracking down the most popular and expensive foreign labels. This was a country whose businessmen went from wearing inexpensive timepieces to suddenly craving $3,000 and $4,000 Mont Blanc watches. Before too long, they were showing off $8,000 and $10,000 Rolexes. Many millionaires and billionaires went out of their way to one-up each other with demonstrations of excess. They would buy out entire shops just for the sake of owning more product than the next person. Women would post photos of closets filled with expensive handbags and designer shoes. The label had become as important as how much the middle class was willing to spend on it. In a country where honor was everything, then saving face sometimes meant spending well beyond your means. If the construction bubble was not about to burst, then perhaps the Chinese credit industry was. The Chinese were not all spend crazy. They still put an emphasis on value and wanted the most for their money. In theme park operations and the service industry, this was something that Disney had very few peers to compete against. Flaunting wealth in China was a guarantee that the person would receive exceptional service wherever they went. This was contrary to the classic Disney model for treating all customers equally well. Hong Kong would test how well that Disney model would work. Disney saw something more than runaway spending of a populace. There was actual measurable growth behind the numbers. By the end of 2015, the country would hold the world's fourth largest concentration of wealthy people behind the USA, Japan, and the United Kingdom. A report by Yuyo Asman and Vinay Dixit, featured in McKinsey & Company, had some amazing numbers associated with Chinese wealth. They pointed out that China's 4 richest cities, Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen, accounted for about 30% of all wealthy consumers. The top 10 cities were home to some 50% of them. Even more surprising was that about half of the Chinese who are wealthy today weren't 4 years ago. And more than half of those who will be wealthy in the next 5 or 6 years, as in 2020, they aren't wealthy today. Only a few years ago, for example, Chinese consumers purchased most of their luxury goods outside of their country. Today, they make 60% of the purchases in mainland China. The decision to have a resort ready in Shanghai, complete with its own shopping complex, hotels, and spas, made tremendous business sense. The investment would be paying off tremendous dividends down the road. Hong Kong was a solid choice for the first park because it had an established international presence. The British had occupied it for most of the 19th and 20th centuries and had introduced the architecture, language, and customs of the West to China. The city had all the modern conveniences and infrastructure of any other major metropolis. It was home to 7 million people, yet was better known as a tourist destination. Hong Kong had almost 50 million visitors in 2012. 34 million of those were visits from mainland China. People were drawn to the fragrant harbor for a number of reasons. One of the largest reasons was the tax code. It was the one place in China where there was no general sales or value-added tax. Many luxury items sold and imported into China came from Hong Kong. There were no tariffs on those imports as well. The tax code in Hong Kong still favored businesses, especially for large-scale employers. There was no payroll tax for Social Security, and businesses paid all the taxes on profits, while employees paid all taxes on salaries. Disney had set up operations in a nation that had progressive tax rates for labor income, but a flat tax of about 17.5% on corporate profits. The group ownership between Disney and Hong Kong, known as the Hong Kong International Theme Parks Limited Company, was mutually beneficial. The lack of taxes for consumers made it a shopping paradise. Entire vacations could be planned for the sole purpose of shopping. The service industry had been doing very well in this environment, the average Hong Kong hotel room occupancy was at about 89%, and average stay was 3.5 nights. Disney hoped that those numbers would be reflected in their newly built resort. I'll talk more about how Disney prepared to open overseas in the next podcast. Before I sign off, just a reminder to support our sponsor. A special shout out to Circa 1955. Nicole is the founder of Luxe Illume, a small company that makes candles, wax melts, and room sprays. Nicole does do custom orders, so if you have a party or wedding coming up, she's the person to help make the best keepsakes. Now, she's also a huge Disney fan, and she has a line called Circa 1955. Nicole creates scents inspired by all things Disney. This includes the parks, attractions, treats, and films. Go to circa1955.com, order a candle, and use promo code PINK15, that's PINK 15, to get 15% off your purchase. You're going to love it. Another shout out to Jim Hill for hosting Pink Monorail on his podcast network. Pink Monorail, normally they feature Shelley and Alice. My name is Noah, and I'm filling in for this China series. The Jim Hill Podcast Network also includes Looking at Lucasfilm with Dan Zer, The Disney Dish with Len Testa. How you doing, Len? I Want That with Shelley, Marvel Us Disney with Aaron Adams, and Fine Tuning with Drew Taylor. Thanks for listening, and be sure to like, subscribe, and if you get a chance, please leave a review for each podcast. I appreciate it. Have a great day.